So firstly, let me start off by welcoming everyone to this event tonight. For those of you who don't know me, my name is John Farrell. I'm the Exhibitions and Retail Coordinator of Street Level Photo Works in Glasgow. And it's my great pleasure tonight to host, or to kind of help run this event between Ashleigh Black and John Perivolaris on the work of George Washington Wilson. Before I briefly introduce Ashleigh and John, I'll just go over the format of the event. So Ashleigh's going to do a short presentation, followed by an in-conversation section with John asking a few questions, and then that will get opened up to the audience. So if you do have any questions that you want to ask, you can either send them to me in the chat box, and I can read them out on your behalf, or if you use the raise your hand feature, that will flag up to me that you've got a question, and then we can turn your camera and audio on. Hopefully we can get a nice conversation started. So before I hand over, I just wanted to introduce Ashleigh and John very briefly. Ashleigh Black is a researcher and PhD candidate at the University of Aberdeen, specialising in the work of George Washington Wilson. So she'll be giving a presentation on some of our research interests and how that kind of relates to this event tonight. And she is joined by artist and writer John Perivolaris, who's based in Glasgow. John was commissioned by the George Washington Wilson Centre for Visual Culture in 2015 to retrace the steps of George Washington Wilson visiting various locations in Aberdeen and to make contemporary photographs. And those were exhibited in Aberdeen in 2016. So there's a nice kind of synergy and relationship there between John and Ashleigh. So before we get stuck into the presentation, I think John's going to do a little bit more of an introduction, and then we'll get kicked off. Hand over to you, John.
Thank you, John. I think it's a great pleasure to host, for Street Level, to host Ashleigh for this talk, but also a very personal pleasure for me, because I've was involved with George Washington Wilson's work in quite an intense way a few years back when I undertook the commission John mentioned. And I think both Ashleigh and I caught the George Washington Wilson bug when, by delving into the sort of archives, the wonderful archives that exist in Aberdeen. Not only his glass plates, but all the other ephemera, which I spent many, many happy hours digging through, in spite of my dust allergy. Ashleigh herself has had a very interesting trajectory to reach this point. So I think I'd like to mention a few of the things she's done and a few of the projects, projects she's involved in at the moment. Her PhD is in film and visual culture, and she's in the penultimate year of that at the University of Aberdeen. But previously, her MLit her undergraduate studies, first of all, were in history and religious studies, which I think is quite interesting. And then her MLit was in museum studies, and I think it was during a placement at that stage in her career with Aberdeen Art Gallery and Museum when she first came into contact with the archive of George Washington Wilson's work, and like me caught the bug at that stage, which has led to this PhD. Her work, I think, is original and groundbreaking, as we shall discover in several ways, in that up to now, I think George Washington Wilson's work has been studied more from an art historical perspective. And Ashleigh, I think her work is quite theoretically sophisticated. And I think in a way she builds a bridge, at least for me, reading her work, between a sort of archaeological or antiquarian sort of view of George Washington Wilson and contemporary photographic practice. And I think this is reflected, well, it's reflected in today's talk when she's talking about his work in the context of the optics of panopticism, which I think has great resonance for photographers practicing today, but also in her capacity as a curator. I mean, she is currently involved in bringing to the surface an angle of George Washington Wilson's work, which I think is very original, which is his representation of women in his oeuvre, which is not something I'm aware anybody else has tackled. And she's currently involved as the curator of an exhibition which is scheduled for 2021, but who knows nowadays, but it will take some form, whether physical and virtual or both, during next year at some stage. So I think enough of an introduction, and I'll pass it over now to Ashleigh and her talk. Over to you, Ashleigh. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you for everyone for being here tonight. It's such an amazing turnout, so thank you for that. I will just mention as well, so the Envisioning Women exhibition was something that was mentioned to me by one of the lecturers here at the University of Aberdeen, Dr. Anya Larkin. She's a senior lecturer in French, and one of her colleagues who works at the Riverside Museum in California visited Aberdeen on a Fulbright scholarship and became very interested in the work of George Washington Wilson. So to be given the opportunity to be involved in a project like that is really amazing. So keep your eyes out, keep your eyes peeled for that. So yeah, as John said, I am a soon to be third year PhD student. So let me just share my screen with you all. 2 seconds, let me get this up. Okay. There we go. It'll go to slideshow. There we are. Okay. So my research centres on the life and work of George Washington Wilson. The University of Aberdeen holds a collection of around 38,000 glass plate negatives taken by Wilson and his company GWW & Co, spanning the length and breadth of the British Empire. And using this rich repository of images, I'm investigating how panopticism can help us understand the significance of some of Wilson's cityscapes and how notions of the panoptic can influence how we view these images in the present day. I'm mainly drawing on conceptions made by Jeremy Bentham, who proposed the archetypal prison panopticon in the late 18th century. So George Washington Wilson was born in rural Aberdeenshire in 1823. His parents, George and Elspeth Wilson, owned a farm in Croft, which they lived and worked on. His father was influential in his son's education. George Sr. was a sergeant major in the army and fought at many significant battles during the Napoleonic Wars, including the siege of Badajoz. George Sr. was multilingual and even revised Latin in order to help his sons with their schoolwork. Wilson's elder brother, Robert Franklin Wilson, recalled in his memoirs how their father adorned their living room with drawings and maps of all the places that he'd visited while serving as a soldier. At the age of 12, Wilson was apprenticed to a local carpenter and completed this apprenticeship by the age of 23. And for reasons that still aren't quite clear, he began to train as an artist in London and then spent some time in Paris before returning to Scotland in around 1849, where he married his wife Maria and established himself as an art teacher and an artist in Aberdeen. He opened his portrait studio on Crown Street in 1852, and in 1854 he began what would grow to be a lifelong association with Queen Victoria, having photographed Balmoral and the royal family by commission of the Prince Consort. In 1861, he was officially granted the title of Royal Photographer to Her Majesty, and in 1873, he went into business with his sons to create GWW & Co. By 1880, the company was one of the largest, if not the largest, publisher of topographic views in Britain. And by the time he was 68, he had won 27 prize medals for his photographs from all over the world. The Photographic Collection held by the university was donated by Archie Strachan in the 1950s, who was also a local photographer. So jumping back historically, slightly, I now turn to the Archetypal Panopticon, first conceived by Jeremy Bentham in his 1791 Panopticon or Inspection House, which outlined plans for the possible construction of a new kind of prison. The building was designed with a central watchtower running through a circular outhouse containing individual cells. A constant backlight was reflected into each cell to ensure that the inmates couldn't see out of them. Simultaneously, a guard or guards would patrol the tower, and each inmate would be under the illusion that they were being watched. Whether or not they were being observed didn't matter, because in either case they would have to adjust their behaviour accordingly. The main aim of the prison panopticon was to instill rehabilitation, not to punish, despite Bentham's advocacy for solitary confinement, although in his defence he firmly believed that solitude would encourage people to rethink their actions. The Panopticon Penitentiary was intended to create a sense of omnipresent surveillance, and Bentham never intended it to become this aesthetically displeasing cage-like structure. He envisioned it to be a place of reform, not degradation and punishment. So, what does photography have to do with the Panopticon? Well, arguably the camera itself is like a panopticon, an all-seeing apparatus, an eye. The word panopticon is derived from the Greek words all and seeing. And looking at his cityscapes, it's clear that Wilson sought to extol these places. You get a sense of this pride of place. He found these panoptic vantage points and was very much an adventurer, whether it was treading the road untravelled in the vast Scottish countryside or climbing towers and other buildings like the Scott Monument with all that equipment in tow. During the early 19th century, the erection of monuments turned away from traditionally religious structures towards secular veneration. The commemoration of important figures in society evolved into a bit more of a public form and memorialized the status that that person held during their life. I think one of the best examples of this is the Scott Monument. So Sir Walter Scott was born in Edinburgh in 1771, and he subsequently rose to fame through his novels and is generally considered to be the inventor of historical fiction. Following the defeat of the Jacobite army at the Battle of Culloden in 1745, Scottish culture was suppressed by the Hanoverian monarchy to the point where it was illegal to even speak in Scots. The works of Sir Walter Scott are closely associated with the revival of Scottish culture and identity, and through his writings, the wider public were given a vision of Scotland which transgressed traditional attitudes towards the place as a wild place stained with the bitterness of defeat. Which brings me to a quote by Leonardo da Vinci. Though the poet is as free as the painter in the invention of his fictions, they are not so satisfactory to men as paintings. Though poetry is able to describe forms, actions, and places in words, the painter deals with the actual similitude of the forms in order to represent them. I think in this case, the word painter can be replaced with the word photographer. Da Vinci was explaining how words are not enough to represent forms like landscapes, but accompanied with the painter's art, these words can be transformed and their power lies in the visual result. This can be said for Sir Walter Scott and George Washington Wilson. In fact, it was one of Wilson's illegitimate sons, Alexander Johnston Wilson, who said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "The camera of George Washington Wilson did as much for the people of Scotland as the pen of Sir Walter Scott." So even back then, this comparison was being made, and a very lofty comparison as well, to be compared to Sir Walter Scott. So I'd now like to turn to George Washington Wilson and his own panoptic vision. Following on from the revival of Scottish culture, we see a sense of the panoptic in Wilson's work, not only in his ability to choose excellent vantage points, but also in how he chose what to show his viewers. Wilson's panoptic vision is not to survey. like another contemporary of his, Thomas Annan, whom I'll mention shortly, but to extol. With this in mind, I now turn to some of Wilson's images of Glasgow. Until now, my research of the collection hasn't really brought me to Glasgow. It's centred more on Edinburgh and Aberdeen, so it's been a really, really nice change to be able to study some of the Glasgow photographs and to be able to talk about them with you all this evening. It's clear that wherever he went, Wilson found his panoptic vantage point. He sought out perspectives that best represented the space that he was in. This is a photograph of George Square, probably taken in the late 1870s or early 1880s. This has been taken just above street level, capturing the citizens of Glasgow as they go about their daily lives. In terms of this new panopticism, Wilson's vantage points were not necessarily taken from high viewpoints. Even at street level, these images are taken just above everyone's heads and above eye level, thus opening up the world to us. Not only can we see how Wilson's technical prowess has progressed, but we can also observe people, fully defined people going about their daily lives, probably unaware that their image is being captured on a glass plate, and yet another panoptic element in Wilson's photographs. This photograph of Jamaica Street, which was taken from a balcony overlooking the crowds, embodies what I mean about this new panopticism. Wilson wanted to show off the city, and of course, the right parts of it. Like every other Victorian city, Glasgow was no exception to poverty, crime, or disease. Which begs the question, why didn't Wilson show us this darker side? Well, put simply, from the perspective of a commercial photographer, poverty doesn't sell. People don't want to pay to see what reminds them of the stark reality of life. They want to be transported somewhere different, and that's exactly what Wilson gave them, the chance to go somewhere else, whether it was through his stereoscopic images of Loch Katrine and the Trossachs, already romanticised by Sir Walter Scott, or simply a view like this one that displays the better parts of the city. And this is what brings me now to mention Thomas Annan. I've been asked by quite a few people how Wilson's work compares to that of Thomas Annan, and I want to talk a bit about that since I finally get to focus on Glasgow. The work of both of these photographers is comparable, but only to a certain extent. While both men are incredibly talented photographers, the main differences reside not just in their work, but in how that work came about. So for instance, Thomas Annan was commissioned by Glasgow City Council to take these photographs of the old closes and streets of Glasgow, perhaps his most well-known work. Mass immigration from rural parts of the country, coupled with other socio-economic factors, led to overcrowding and extremely unsanitary conditions. The images taken by Annan on this project serve not just as a record of what these old tenements look like, but also as proof of the existence of the people that lived there, and essentially a dying way of life. And if you look closely at this image on the screen, these people are acutely aware of Annan's presence. Being so enclosed in such a confined space, it would be difficult to go undetected, especially with a camera. But Wilson, he could just be another face in the crowd, standing behind his camera on a busy open street. Annan captured the inherent poverty and deprivation of some of Glasgow's poorest citizens. With this in mind, when we turn to Wilson's work, they seem a lot less comparable. Arguably, like Wilson, Annan's photographs tell a story of modernity, but in a much more intrusive way, thereby deflating any trace of romantic rhetoric. There is no sense of awe and wonder in Annan's work in Glasgow, only a terrifying presence embodying the rapidity of the Industrial Revolution and the price of modernity. By contrast, Wilson was not commissioned to take his photographs. He was an artist by trade and also had great business acumen. As Roger Taylor described him, he was the embodiment of the Victorian self-made man. So turning to this photograph of Argyle Street in contrast to the picture from Annan that we've just seen, we see the difference. As a commercial photographer, Wilson had the advantage of not only manipulating the camera, but what he wanted the viewer to observe. In this photograph, we see a city that is thriving, and so is its people. But what we don't see, or rather what Wilson chooses not to show us, is the reality of abject poverty and disease that was rife in even the most majestic of Victorian cities. This photograph was likely taken sometime in the 1880s. The clarity of the images like this cannot be underestimated, Not only can we pinpoint individuals in a crowd, we can observe other intricate details, such as items of clothing, shop signs, and street lamps. Our line of vision is guided by the camera, and our eyes are drawn to the street itself, and in turn, we see these people going about their business, going to work or sightseeing or shopping. We get a glimpse of the hustle and bustle of Glasgow as it was in Wilson's time, and in that instance hasn't really changed that much. So I'm going to finish with this photograph. This one's one of my favourites from the Glasgow images. I've always admired how Wilson was able to capture objects in motion, whether it was people or indeed water, as we can see from this beautiful image. I've thoroughly enjoyed researching these photographs of Glasgow. And again, it's taken me so long to get here, but that just goes to show you how vast and rich the University of Aberdeen George Washington Wilson collection really is. Wilson's photographs are unique, and you definitely get a sense of that when you look deeper into the collection. Both Wilson and Thomas Annan were immensely talented in their work, but it was so vastly different, and it's challenging to make a comparison. Rather, it makes sense to show their work as two contrasting aspects of Scottish photography in the 19th century. Married with the pen of Sir Scott, Wilson sought to extol the places that he visited, and you get a much deeper sense of that when you look at his images of Scotland, and this isn't just confined to the Highlands. Wilson romanticised the city. Like most people his age, Wilson was likely brought up with the tales written by Scott, intermingled with the folklore and legends that his grandmother told him by the fireside as a child. Not to mention that his father's nostalgia for the places that he visited while serving as a soldier, it's no wonder that he turned out to be such an adventurer. I think Wilson saw something inherently beautiful in Scotland's cities, whether it was in the capital or indeed the third capital, Aberdeen. The panoptic or new panopticism aspect within Wilson's photographs lie not only in his ability to bring this sense of pride of place, but to turn the world not only stirs wonder, but transports the viewer entirely. The roots of Wilson's panoptic vision can be found in the very basic elements of Bentham's Archetypal Panopticon, which is of course observation. Wilson observed, but not to survey, not to spy, but to extol and thereby transform people's perceptions about Scotland's cities. I'd like to thank everyone for listening to my presentation this evening. I do have obviously a lot of the source information, so if anyone wants any of that, feel free to ask. And also, if you get the chance, do please go online and look at the university's collection. They've got an excellent tool called Digitool, which allows you to zoom in on the pictures and really sort of get a feel for the detail of Wilson's images. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, after you, John. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ashleigh. That was extremely informative and nuanced, and I'd like to take you up on a couple of aspects of the panopticism side of things. I was very pleased that you were selective in your use of this as a theoretical framework, because you did draw out a basic difference between George Washington Wilson's panopticism, which, apart from the optical panopticism which a camera offered him, the mere fact that he took so many thousands of photographs of every single corner of not just the city of Scotland, but the landscapes of Scotland, makes it a sort of panoptic vision, in that it's encyclopedic, it's completely comprehensive, and from, revealed, brought into visual culture Scotland in a way that had never happened before. And he was largely, I think, responsible for the boom in tourism, along with his association, obviously, with Queen Victoria, which made it all very fashionable. But what I liked about the talk was that instead of Bentham's reforming sort of moralism, you know, that sort of sense of morality and sort of correcting behavior, which you see in his view of panopticism, or Foucault's punitive panopticism, Wilson presents something very different through his lens, which is exactly as you said, I think, the extolling the glories of the new Scottish cities. Particularly Aberdeen at that time was really very much in construction. And he did photograph a lot of the city being, particularly the harbour area, being constructed at that time. So that's one aspect. But I'd like also to bring this panoptic view up to date, because I think this opens it out to further questions maybe from the audience. And I'll base these observations on my own experience of following in his footsteps. And following in his footsteps in 2015, I felt was a very different experience from what he must have had, you know, in the Victorian period. I was, with every step, I was entirely aware all the time, and I was reminded constantly by security guards or policemen that I was in of the panopticism, state and privatized, of a modern 21st century city such as Aberdeen. As I revisited locations around the city and photographed by George Washington Wilson and his team, recording the urban environment of contemporary Aberdeen, it became clear that several of the vantage points that he was able to have access to had disappeared or were difficult to find, obscured by barriers, security devices, that regulate our movements as photographers through cities today. The only way I could get those sort of glorious views he got, let's say down Union Street or other parts, it was to climb onto the roofs of car parks. I got a very, in this privatized space, I got a great sense of visual freedom to look down on the city from there. So this leads to the question, and this question is not just for you, but for the audience as well, of how the meaning of public or civic space has evolved from George Washington Wilson's day, and what the role of the photographer might be in that space, thinking back on George Washington. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that I'm addressing currently in my thesis. So looking at sort of civic space, city space in general, and with a focus on Aberdeen. So my focus has been on the Castlegate or Castle Street area of Aberdeen. For those of you that don't really know Aberdeen, the Castlegate is where the Mercat Cross is in Aberdeen. It used to be the city centre, and is named after the castle that used to exist there at the time of Robert the Bruce. Was apparently burned down by the English, and it's in this space where markets were held, proclamations. It's where the municipal buildings were erected, public executions. So this very much was the city centre. But now, the city centre space has moved. It's moved to Union Square. It's moved into a shopping mall. And the Castlegate now is very much just a place that people walk over or walk by and doesn't really herald much significance for them. But I think addressing the role of the photographer, I mean, if you're looking at it through George Washington Wilson's perspective, while he was photographing that space, I mean, to him, not only would aspects of the city be very new and very sort of fresh, if you like, you've also got this historic Castlegate, this historic part of the city that still held a lot of significance even in his day. They still held the annual market there every year. So for a photographer like him, there were still people living there. There was still lots of life there. So I think he probably would have seen it as his role to keep that alive, but not so much in a documentary form like Thomas Annan.
I can't wait to read what your thoughts when you publish your research. Yeah, that's. Shall we open this up to the audience, John?
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, as I said, you can either use the raise hand function and I can read them out on your behalf, or you can unmute yourself and just ask the question directly. I just wanted to say, thank you very much, Ashleigh, for the talk. It was really enlightening. And I know that John mentioned it in his introduction, but could you maybe just say a little bit more about the exhibition that's planned and where that's going to be, and the kind of specifics of George Washington Wilson in relation to depictions of women?
So the exhibition for envisioning women, again, it's not really, so it's not my exhibition, but it's just something that I'm assisting with, that I'm an assistant curator on. Again, I'm not really sure whether it's going to remain a physical exhibition. It could be a virtual one just due to COVID. Because it was originally planned to be held simultaneously in Aberdeen and at the Riverside Museum in California. But again, I think my colleagues on it, Dr. Larkin and her colleague her name escapes me, really bad. But I think they're both just still kind of working out the logistics for that. But currently I'm curating my own exhibition, which focuses on the panoptic element in George Washington Wilson's Cityscapes, and that's going to be an entirely virtual exhibition. And I'll hopefully be posting that at the beginning of the year, putting that up, but we'll see how that goes.
Great, look forward to it.
Yeah.
In your own research, I know you mentioned the digital tool that the University of Aberdeen has set up. Is your research kind of conducted that way, or do you actually get to handle the material and work with the kind of physical plates and prints and things like that? No,
so access to the physical plates is extremely limited. I think, the plates when they were donated to the university were in decent condition. I think mainly because Wilson treated those plates like they were his family. They were so looked after in their lifetimes and afterwards. So I think that's kind of why they've survived in such good condition. But no, thanks to a project I think that ran, oh gosh, it must be a good 10, 20 years ago now. There was a project that ran at the university which saw the digitization of pretty much most of the photographs. A lot of them are catalogued, vast majority aren't. So it's really interesting to see which ones have been and which ones haven't. Yeah, and it's been nice for me as well to kind of to do a bit more research on the collection. It's just, there's so much to search in it. So yeah, I think my research is just one tiny little chunk of a huge sort of universe, if you like, an image world, as Susan Spitag would have said.
Brilliant. We've got a question here from Jeremy, who asks, can you say something about George Washington Wilson's photographic technique compared to Annan's?
His techniques? So yeah, I don't know much about Thomas Annan's technique. I'm not entirely sure what method he would have used, but I can tell you, so Wilson used the collodion method. He, towards the sort of 1850s, he developed what he called instantaneous exposures. So I actually discovered this formula the other day, and I'll get out my notes. So he essentially invented a new chemical developer alongside the collodion process. So he used a solution of protosulfate of iron and acetic acid as a developer, which was something that was long kept a secret by Wilson. And he was actually followed by an editor of the Photographic News. And that's how the secret came out. And that's how that process was adopted universally with the collodion process.
Great. We've got a question from Rachel Nordstrom, so I think she's going to ask that directly. I'll hand over to Rachel.
Thanks very much, Ashleigh. It's great to see you and to hear about your work with George Washington Wilson. And what I'm interested in, this kind of goes off what John was saying. I really like this idea of sort of the comprehensive view and the feeding into tourism in this, but how this sort of elevated panoptic view that you're talking about is sort of that novel. It's a novel view for so many people. People wouldn't have had that exposure to much of Scotland or internationally before, and the city views, and that sort of leads to romanticism that I think people really liked, sort of seeing the town and the cityscapes from a slightly elevated new view. And what I'm kind of curious about just from this is looking at other photographers. You've mentioned Annan, but we have, there's other proficient photographers, James Valentine, for example. And I'd really be curious, are you going to be doing any comparative work between George Washington Wilson and other photographers? I would be curious to see if those that were very proficient and had very successful businesses used that sort of panoptic vision more so than sort of the local street photographer, who had a few views of their hometown or whatever. But I don't know. I'm just curious to see if you're going to expand that out at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I've sort of touched on in a previous chapter that I've written, so which focuses on sort of comparisons between George Washington Wilson and James Valentine, who was considered his biggest rival in commercial photography, and then alongside other contemporaries of his, so including Thomas Annan, Archibald Burns, John Thompson as well, Horatio Ross. So there are obviously, as you say, many other sort of contemporary photographers working in that time, and I think James Valentine is definitely the one to compare. And it's interesting to see. I mean, there was a running joke at the time that James Valentine would follow in the footsteps of George Washington Wilson, and trying to find his tripod holes in the ground. So I think even then there was almost this kind of sort of running bias that, it's Wilson's photographs, they're better, But obviously, I mean, Valentine of Dundee was the one that company endured. So it was interesting to see the comparisons between the companies and how one lasted and one unfortunately didn't. So it's something that I'm definitely sort of writing about and will be including in my work as well.
Yeah, I like that joke about the three the tripod holes, because both sides of the story, both families, descendants tell the same joke, but about the other one. So, yeah. But I welcome you to at some point we can talk offline. But I manage the photographic collection at St. Andrews, so you're welcome to get in touch and we can talk about Valentine if you wish anytime.
Oh, perfect! Thank you.
We've got another couple of questions, but just before when we were talking about Thomas Annan, John had asked in the chat if anyone knew about Annan's technique, and Frank McElhinney has commented to say that it was wet plate collodion was a technique that Annan used in Glasgow. We've got a question here from Alan Kelly who says, "Thank you, Ashleigh, very interesting. I read that Wilson had claimed to have sold over 500,000 prints by 1864. Is that realistic? And what do you think today's equivalent figure would be?" That's a tough one.
That's a very tough one. I don't know what the equivalent would be today, to be honest. But no, it's certainly it is a realistic figure for the amount of negatives and prints that Wilson was making by that point. He'd well established himself internationally as a landscape and portrait photographer by that point, and was sort of getting to the stage of sort of manufacturing his prints, and by the 1870s, he'd rented out an old distillery, and that's where he began manufacturing his prints, and then moving on to St. Swithin Street, which was again a huge building for manufacturing these prints. So yeah, an unprecedented scale of photographs. But unfortunately, I have no idea what that would equivalent today, but what that would equate today. But it'd be some size of a collection if they were able to match that today.
Yeah. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Any other comments? Or
can I ask a question, John?
Yeah, of course, please do.
Yeah. That was fascinating. First of all, Ashleigh, really enjoyed that talk. One of the things you said in the talk when you were comparing Annan and Washington Wilson was that when Annan was photographed in Glasgow, he was doing it on commission. And there was a book a few years ago that came out that was Sarah Stevenson wrote on Annan, and she was basically saying that there was no evidence that work was commissioned initially, although some of the photographs were sold on later. And I think in a way, the argument was that he was kind of self-motivated in making that work, and he had friends that were involved in charitable works to try and improve the situation of a lot of the people that were living in poverty around street level, John, at that time, because all the streets around there. And so I was just thinking about what you said about this idea of one photographer basically surveying and the other extolling, because I think in a way you could argue that Annan was also extolling Glasgow, but just in a different way, because what he was doing was looking at how the city had actually cleaned up its act, or was cleaning up its act, because there's a lot of Irish, a lot of people from the Highlands that just, populated that part of the city, and there'd been plagues of cholera and so on. But water coming from Loch Katrine, again, the Walter Scott connection, had just been connected down through to Glasgow. And those areas that were being photographed by Annan had actually gone through a process of improvement in the years just before he photographed them. So yeah, I don't know. I could say a lot more, but I suppose it's just that idea that, in a way, both photographers are documenting the city, and in their own way, from their own perspective. I think also maybe there's an element of them extolling it also.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could say that about certainly about some of Annan's images of Glasgow, but I think maybe he did go and photograph some of it on his own, but there's certainly quite a lot to suggest that I think it was the Glasgow Improvement Trust that did commission him to take it, maybe at least some of the photographs, maybe not all of them in that collection, because there was some sort of issue with him sort of going out to take these pictures, because I think the day after there was some of these areas that were getting completely like bulldozed and demolished. So he was in a real hurry to kind of to document some of these old streets and closes. He did another commission for, I think it was the waterworks that you'd mentioned. I think he did another commission for them, and he did take a lot of landscape photographs and did submit them into exhibitions, I think, alongside other photographers like Valentine and Wilson. But it's interesting because Annan's work gets quite mixed reviews. There was quite a few people during the sort of the 1860s that sort of looked at his work as very unremarkable in comparison, which is quite interesting. So yeah, I think you can definitely say that Annan is extolling parts of the old closes of Glasgow, because I mean, as I say, it was a dying way of life. That's what they were trying to get away from. They were trying to make improvements to these people's lives, and I think absolutely right in saying that. Yeah, he was trying to say, these people are trying to make a difference. They're hanging their washing out. there's perceptions that maybe people had of poor people at that time that he was trying to sort of get rid of, and I think that's, yeah, it's a good point.
I know that I asked you this question when we spoke the other week, but is there much evidence of Annan and Wilson having any kind of correspondence, or being, certainly you mentioned that they were kind of aware of each other, but
yeah, they certainly would have been aware of each other. In terms of correspondence, it's difficult because there's not a lot of sort of correspondence that survives from George Washington Wilson. So we know that Wilson kept sketchbooks and diaries, and I believe Roger Taylor has a few excerpts in his private collection, but the majority of it was lost, unfortunately. So, and I think the Aberdeen Art Gallery here has a few letters penned by Wilson, but they're not really to do with sort of other photographers, which is a shame. It's that we don't really have that resource. But no, they certainly would have been aware of each other, and I think they did sort of submit work in the same exhibitions, and they were moving in the same circles. So
yeah,
they would have been aware.
John, could I ask a question?
Yes,
okay?
yes, please
Hi.
do. Yeah.
Hi, Ashleigh. I'm Annie Lydon from National Galleries of Scotland. I really enjoyed your talk tonight, and I really just want to pick up on some of the things that Frank mentioned earlier, because I feel like that was a really valid line of inquiry, and I would encourage you, as you're continuing in working on your thesis, to maybe reconsider your position on Thomas Annan. And one of the lines I think that I'm interested in and have a question for you is with regard to the sort of financial backing that Washington Wilson had with regard to his business, because I don't think there's the difference that you're making out between Annan's work and Wilson's work. If you look at some of Annan's work around the sort of Trongate area, you still have that kind of panoptic view of the cityscape and the people. He wasn't always just going into the closes and photographing in the dark. And sorry, I've just seen I don't have the light on, so I'm in the dark here, sorry. And also that image that you ended with of the water fountain in Kelvin Grove Park, Annan photographed that water fountain a few years earlier, and that was part of the Glasgow Waterworks, because it was to do with the bringing the water from Loch Katrine into the city, and it was only when the statue was erected at the top, which is alluding back to Walter Scott's Lady of the Lake, that again you have this kind of completion that you're talking about. But Annan was very much aware of that too, and again his work was being, as you say, shown in other exhibitions, but he was winning medals as well. I think 1865 his view of Dumbarton Castle won, I think, either silver medal for best picture of the year. So it's, I think it probably just needs to be considered as to, well, what are the other factors, because I think there's a lot more similarities there, but indeed they had very different trajectories. So is it because Wilson had this really incredible entrepreneurial business and was employing, tens of people, a lot of women out sort of printing, and where was that money sort of coming from? Was it just sales? And is that where the difference is between the two photographers, where Annan is a much smaller operation? Sorry, that was a rambling question.
No, it's okay. Undoubtedly. Annan's was much smaller in comparison to Wilson's. But what do you mean about the financial backing? As in, where was the money coming from?
Well, just how much money did he have invested into the business that allowed him to do this to that extent? Because, I think that's probably where you're going to find a line of inquiry.
Yeah, in terms of how much money, I'm not sure. Roger Taylor did an extensive amount of research into looking at the sort of the financial history of the company, and he did manage to sort of glean some figures. So, as in some of the amounts that Wilson was paid for his commissions at Balmoral. by Queen Victoria. There's quite a few, I think, that he found in sort of the Royal Archives at Kew and things, but on the business itself, there's not a lot of information. But I think the majority of the money probably did come from his sales and his sort of early commissions for Queen Victoria. He'd made those connections quite early in his career.
Okay. Thank you. I think it's in terms of that capital that's invested then, does that then allow a freedom of movement for him to go out and about and do more of this type of work, to then also be creative and inventive in the different formats that he's using to then sell the work to create more of a market too? You know, that's what I'm saying, just it's like that sort of mechanics of it, and that's helping to support the business, rather than just like he's this person extolling Scotland. Like, he was a very shrewd business person.
Yeah, oh no, undoubtedly. I mean, in sort of the 1860s, he trained these sort of portrait photographers himself at his Crown Street studio so that he could go away and take these views. And he did construct his own sort of traveling darkroom that was pulled along with his horse, and I think that obviously gave him a bit more freedom of movement, along with the collodion process, and sort of he's developing his own sort of photographic methods. I think there was kind of a lot of other factors to consider with Wilson, other than just a purely sort of business aspect of it. I think he was very much a man that sort of made his own opportunities, and sort of grabbed each one as it came sort of to him.
Thank you.
Great. We've got a question from Tom Astbury, and we'll probably have time for one more question after that, if anyone's got anything pressing on their mind. And over to you, Tom.
Yeah, it's quite a quick one, really. I've been involved in cataloguing quite a lot of Washington Wilsons with the Mackinnon collection as a volunteer, well, until lockdown kind of finished it for the at the moment. So much documentary evidence with the Aberdeen collection that certainly into the 1880s that George Washington Wilson was physically still travelling and taking the pictures himself, or was, because the output was huge, or was a team of. Is there any evidence at all of who was taking them if it wasn't George?
There's quite a few photographs, not just within sort of the Aberdeen images in sort of the 1880s, because obviously Wilson retired in 1888. So I think certainly by the early 1880s, there was definitely other photographers that were going out and taking these photographs. So it's more GWW and Co. rather than George Washington Wilson. And these included 3 of his sons, who eventually sort of helped him run the business towards the end of his life and towards his retirement. So I think, yeah, there, in terms of evidence, there's some photographs that have been registered by the photographers who took them, and there is that information sort of in the metadata for each photograph, but unfortunately it's not there for every single individual one. So I think a lot of it is kind of speculation and just trying to work out whether he would have taken those images. I think the Aberdeen ones probably was him. I think early 1880s, he's probably not going to travel much more than sort of outside his front door. But I think looking at other photographs of other geographical areas in that time frame, I think you're pretty safe to say that it wasn't him.
Yeah, as a slight aside, in the periphery of a lot of photographs, well, looked at hundreds of them a few months ago. There's particularly a series, I don't know, 1860s, 1870s, and the Scottish borders on sunny days. There's a man in the hat, sometimes used in frame to give scale, but very occasionally, right in the periphery of frame, he's just kind of lounging in the grass, big beardy bloke with a hat. And I've been speculating whether that was George Washington Wilson and an assistant pressed the shutter.
Glengarry bonnet, and it probably is him.
Yeah, it's just have you come across the man in the hat and
Yeah.
often than you've been looking at? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a few of the street photographs that he features in, with his sort of his big beard and his Glengarry bonnet. His bonnet is what he used as his shutter mechanism, because there was obviously none available at that point. I think it was about 1/6 of a second that he was able to sort of remove the lens caps and put his hat over the over the camera. So yeah, if it's a man in a bonnet with a bushy beard, it's him.
Thank you.
Hi, John, you want to come back in?
Yeah, there's a story about the hat. He wasn't a shy man, and apparently he used to announce that he would be taking a photograph somewhere, and the crowd would gather around, and he'd show them his hat technique. This is one of the things I read in one of the old newspapers from the time. So there was a whole show around the famous hat.
Yeah, I mean it's quite a genius thing when you think about it. Getting those sort of quick instant snapshots. I mean, well, not instant in the sense that we think of instant, but yeah. I think, well, if I was him, I would have wanted to show that off. Pretty cool technique.
Great. Do we have one more question or any comments or? There it goes. Peter Blair just said some of the Wilson negatives in the Aberdeen collection have the actual photographer's name on them.
Yeah.
And in relation to the fountain in Kelvin Grove, Frank had just commented to say that it's the Stewart Memorial Fountain, and Stewart was the politician who championed the project to provide water to the city. So there's a wee bit more information there. So yeah, unless there's kind of one last fine and burning question, I think we can probably wrap up. It's been a great evening, a great event, and as I say, there's been no more questions coming through. Just a comment from Jeremy saying thank you, look forward to hear more about the exhibition next year, and I think I can speak for everyone else to say that we're the same. We're looking forward to seeing it, and yeah,
fingers crossed it will be next year, but COVID providing.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, so just on behalf of myself, Street Level, and everyone here, thank you so much for your talk, and thank you, John Perivolaris, as well. Thanks for the amazing questions. I've recorded this talk, so it will be available on our YouTube channel if anyone wants to revisit it or share it with people who you think might be interested. And if any pressing questions come after the event, or you maybe want to just speak to Ashleigh directly, if you send an email to John at Street Level Photoworks, I can put everyone in touch. And yeah, so thanks again, and have a great night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.